Sarah Martinez had always been different from other kids. While her classmates played video games or scrolled through social media, she spent her afternoons at her grandfather's old farm, learning to handle rifles that were almost as tall as she was. Her hands would shake whenever she picked up a weapon, not from fear, but from a medical condition called essential tremor that ran in her family. The tremor made simple tasks difficult. Writing neatly was a challenge. Drinking from a full cup without spilling required concentration. But somehow, when Sarah wrapped her fingers around the cold metal of a rifle stock, something magical happened. The shaking would settle into a rhythm, and she learned to work with it instead of against it. Her grandfather, Miguel, was a former Marine who had served 3 tours overseas. He noticed Sarah's natural eye for distance and angles even when her hands betrayed her. "Mija," he would say in his gentle voice, "the best shooters aren't the ones with the steadiest hands. They're the ones who understand their own body and make peace with it." Sarah's parents worried about their daughter's unusual hobby. Her mother, Carmen, thought it was too dangerous and masculine for a teenage girl. Her father, Roberto, wondered if she should focus on more traditional activities like sports or music. But Miguel convinced them that target shooting was teaching Sarah discipline, patience, and confidence she couldn't find anywhere else. At school, Sarah kept her shooting skills private. She was already considered odd by her classmates because of her trembling hands and quiet nature. During lunch, she would sit alone, watching her fingers shake as she tried to eat her sandwich. The popular kids would sometimes mimic her tremor, making exaggerated shaking motions when they thought she wasn't looking. Sarah learned to eat quickly and keep her hands hidden under the table. Her English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was one of the few adults who showed genuine kindness. She noticed that Sarah's handwriting was messy, but her ideas were sharp and insightful. "Don't let anyone make you feel less than," Mrs. Rodriguez told her one afternoon. "Your mind is brilliant and your spirit is strong. Those hands that shake, they're part of what makes you unique." On weekends, Sarah would escape to the farm where judgment didn't exist. Miguel had set up targets at various distances, starting with simple paper bullseyes at 50 yards. Sarah's first attempts were embarrassing. Her shots scattered wildly across the target board, some missing entirely. But Miguel never showed frustration. Instead, he taught her breathing techniques, showed her how to find her natural pause between heartbeats, and helped her understand how her tremor created a predictable pattern she could learn to anticipate. Months passed, and Sarah's accuracy slowly improved. She moved from 50 yards to 100, then 200. Miguel began timing her sessions, teaching her about wind patterns, humidity effects, and how temperature changes affected bullet trajectory. Sarah absorbed every lesson like a sponge, filling notebooks with calculations and observations that her shaking hands made barely readable. The breakthrough came on a cold November morning. Sarah was practicing at 300 yards, a distance that had been giving her trouble for weeks. Her hands were shaking more than usual because of the cold, and she felt frustrated. Miguel noticed her tension and called for a break. "Tell me what you see," he said, handing her a pair of binoculars. Sarah studied the target through the lenses. The wind was moving the grass in consistent waves. The morning sun was creating shadows that fell in predictable patterns. She could see how the light would affect her sight picture and how the wind would push her bullet slightly to the right. "I can read it," she whispered, surprised by her own revelation. When she returned to the shooting position, something had changed. Her tremor was still there, but she no longer fought it. She let her hands find their natural rhythm, waited for the precise moment when everything aligned, and squeezed the trigger with perfect timing. The shot was dead center. Miguel smiled and nodded. "Now you understand. Your hands don't shake because you're weak. They shake because you're sensitive to everything around you. Most people have to learn to feel what you feel naturally." That afternoon, Sarah called her parents to share her breakthrough. Carmen was proud but still worried, while Roberto was amazed that his daughter had found something she excelled at despite her condition. They agreed to let her continue training as long as her grades stayed good and she remained responsible about safety. As winter turned to spring, Sarah's reputation at the farm began to spread. Miguel's old Marine buddies would stop by occasionally, and he would quietly mention his granddaughter's unusual talent. Word reached the local shooting club, where a few members expressed polite skepticism about a teenage girl with trembling hands being any kind of serious marksman. Sarah didn't know it yet, but her skills were about to be put to a test that would change everything. The regional precision shooting competition was approaching, and Miguel had been considering whether to suggest Sarah enter. The competition drew participants from across 3 states, including former military personnel and professional shooters who had been perfecting their craft for decades. The minimum qualifying distance was 500 yards, with the final round extending to distances that most recreational shooters never attempted. Sarah had been practicing at those ranges for months, but competing against experienced adults would be entirely different from shooting alone at the farm with her grandfather's gentle encouragement. Miguel watched his granddaughter pack up her equipment after another successful practice session. Her hands were shaking as she cleaned her rifle, but her movements were confident and practiced. She had developed her own system for managing the tremor, using it as a timing mechanism rather than fighting against it. "What are you thinking about, abuelo?" Sarah asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. Miguel smiled at his granddaughter. "I'm thinking about how proud your grandmother would be if she could see you now. She always said the strongest people are the ones who turn their struggles into strengths." Sarah felt a warm feeling in her chest. She was beginning to understand that her trembling hands, which had caused her so much embarrassment and frustration throughout her childhood, might actually be the key to discovering her true potential. She just didn't know how dramatically that potential would be tested, or how many people would soon be watching those shaking fingers perform what seemed impossible. 3 weeks before the regional competition, Sarah's world was turned upside down by an unexpected encounter at Miller's sporting goods store in town. She had gone there with Miguel to purchase new ammunition for her practice sessions, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out dollar bills to pay for the boxes of precision rounds. Behind the counter stood Jake Morrison, a man in his 40s with arms covered in military tattoos and a permanent scowl. He had served as an army sniper for 12 years and now ran a private security company. Jake had heard whispers about Miguel's granddaughter and her supposed shooting abilities, and he wasn't impressed by what he saw. "This the girl everyone's talking about?" Jake asked Miguel, barely glancing at Sarah. "The one who's supposed to be some kind of natural shooter?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn as Jake's eyes focused on her shaking hands. She tried to steady them by clasping them behind her back, but the movement only made her appear more nervous. Miguel's jaw tightened. "Sarah has been training hard. She's earned her reputation fairly." Jake laughed, a harsh sound that made other customers turn to look. "Look, no disrespect to the old man's teaching, but precision shooting isn't a game for kids with medical problems. Those hands look like they couldn't hold a coffee cup steady, let alone a rifle at distance." The store fell quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah felt every eye in the place watching her, waiting to see how she would respond. Her tremor seemed to worsen under the scrutiny, making her fingers flutter visibly. "She shoots better than most Marines I knew," Miguel said firmly. "Marines, sure," Jake replied with a dismissive wave. "But we're talking about real precision work here. The kind that matters when lives are on the line." He turned to address the other customers, his voice carrying across the store. "I mean, look at her. Sweet kid, I'm sure, but those shaking hands would be a liability in any serious situation." Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "I can shoot." Jake's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained condescending. "I'm sure you can hit paper at 100 yards, sweetheart. But real marksmanship? The kind that takes nerves and control? That's a different world entirely." An older man near the rifle display rack spoke up. "Jake's got a point. I've been shooting for 30 years and I've never seen anyone with a tremor who could handle precision work at distance. The mechanics just don't work." Sarah felt her confidence crumbling. These were experienced shooters, people who understood the technical demands of long-range accuracy. Maybe they were right. Maybe her success at the farm was just Miguel being kind to his granddaughter, creating artificial conditions where she could feel accomplished. But then Miguel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Tell you what, Jake, why don't you come out to the farm this Saturday? See for yourself what Sarah can do." Jake's eyes lit up with interest. "You serious about that?" "Dead serious. Bring whoever you want as witnesses. We'll set up targets at distances of your choosing." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fired round. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized what her grandfather had just committed her to. Jake Morrison wasn't just some casual weekend shooter. He was a professional who had made his living with a rifle in some of the world's most dangerous places. "All right," Jake said, crossing his arms. "But let's make this interesting. If your granddaughter can outshoot me at distance, I'll publicly apologize and recommend her for the regional competition myself. But when she can't, you stop spreading stories about her being some kind of prodigy." Miguel extended his hand. "Deal." Sarah wanted to protest, to explain that she wasn't ready for this kind of pressure, but the handshake was already complete. She spent the drive home in silence, staring at her trembling hands and wondering what her grandfather had gotten her into. That evening, Sarah barely touched her dinner. Carmen noticed her daughter's unusual quietness and asked what was wrong. When Sarah explained the situation, her mother's face went pale. "Miguel, what were you thinking?" Carmen confronted her father-in-law. "This man is a professional soldier. Sarah's just a teenager with a medical condition." "That teenager," Miguel replied calmly, "can outshoot 90% of the men I served with. Jake Morrison is about to learn that the hard way." Roberto was torn between supporting his daughter and protecting her from potential humiliation. "Maybe we should call this off. There's no shame in avoiding a confrontation that could hurt Sarah's confidence." But Sarah surprised everyone by speaking up. "No, I want to do this." Her family stared at her in amazement. The quiet, insecure girl who usually avoided confrontation was volunteering to face down a professional marksman in front of witnesses. "I'm tired of people looking at my hands and deciding what I can't do," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "If I'm going to compete in the regional championship, I need to prove myself eventually. Might as well be now." Miguel smiled proudly. "That's my granddaughter talking." The next few days passed in intensive preparation. Miguel adjusted Sarah's training routine, focusing on performance under pressure rather than perfect conditions. He invited a few neighbors to watch her practice sessions, gradually increasing the number of observers until Sarah could maintain her accuracy, even with a small crowd present. Sarah also worked on her mental preparation. She practiced visualization techniques, imagining herself succeeding under Jake's skeptical gaze. She rehearsed staying calm when her hands shook more visibly, reminding herself that the tremor was part of her natural rhythm, rather than a weakness to overcome. On Friday evening, the night before the challenge, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her hands were shaking more than usual, a combination of nerves and excitement. She thought about all the people who had doubted her over the years, all the times she had hidden her hands in shame, all the moments when she had felt different and defective. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would either prove that her trembling hands were capable of extraordinary precision, or she would confirm every skeptic's assumption about her limitations. Either way, she would finally know the truth about her own abilities. Miguel knocked softly on her door and entered with a cup of warm milk. "How are you feeling, mija?" "Scared," Sarah admitted, "but also ready." He sat on the edge of her bed and took her shaking hands in his steady ones. "Your grandmother used to tell me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." Sarah nodded, understanding that tomorrow wasn't just about shooting accuracy. It was about proving to herself and everyone else that being different didn't mean being less capable. Her trembling hands held more potential than anyone realized, and she was finally ready to show the world what they could accomplish. Saturday morning arrived gray and windy with clouds threatening rain. Sarah woke before dawn, her stomach churning with nervous energy. She had barely slept, spending most of the night listening to her heart pound and feeling her hands shake beneath the covers. Today would determine whether months of training and her grandfather's faith in her abilities were justified, or if she was just a delusional teenager with a medical condition. By 8 o'clock, vehicles began arriving at Miguel's farm. Jake Morrison pulled up in a black pickup truck, followed by 3 other men Sarah didn't recognize. Word had spread through the local shooting community, and more spectators kept arriving throughout the morning. What had started as a simple challenge between 2 marksmen was turning into a public spectacle. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Miguel greeted the growing crowd. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup. Carmen stood behind her daughter, gently rubbing her shoulders. "You don't have to do this," her mother whispered. "No one will think less of you if you change your mind." But Sarah shook her head. "I need to know if I'm really good or if Abuelo has just been protecting my feelings all these years." The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people by the time Sarah finally walked outside. She recognized several faces from Miller's Sporting Goods, some local hunters, and a few men who carried themselves with the confident bearing of military veterans. All eyes turned to her as she approached, many focusing immediately on her visibly trembling hands. Jake Morrison stepped forward with a condescending smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Ready for your lesson in real shooting?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She was wearing her grandfather's old Marine Corps shooting jacket, modified to fit her smaller frame. The weight of the heavy canvas helped calm her nerves slightly. Miguel had prepared 3 shooting positions at different distances. The first station was set at 400 yards, which most of the spectators considered a respectable long-range shot. The second was at 800 yards, a distance that challenged even experienced marksmen. The final position was set at 200 yards, nearly 3/4 of a mile away, where the targets appeared as tiny specks barely visible to the naked eye. "We'll start close and work our way back," Jake announced to the crowd. 5 shots each at every distance. Whoever has the tighter grouping wins that round. Best 2 out of 3 takes the overall victory. Sarah examined her rifle one final time, checking the scope settings and ensuring everything was properly aligned. Her hands shook as she ran through her pre-shooting routine, but she forced herself to focus on the familiar rituals Miguel had taught her. Breathing control, natural point of aim, understanding the wind conditions. The first station seemed almost too easy after months of practicing at much longer ranges. Sarah settled into her shooting position, feeling the familiar comfort of the rifle stock against her cheek. The target was clearly visible through her scope. A standard black circle on white paper. Jake went first, firing 5 deliberate shots with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. Through binoculars, the crowd could see his shots grouped tightly in the center ring, each hole overlapping the others. Several spectators murmured appreciatively. "Not bad for an old soldier," one man called out, earning chuckles from the group. Jake stood and brushed dust from his knees. "Your turn, kid." Sarah approached the shooting position, acutely aware of every eye watching her trembling hands. She could hear whispered comments from the crowd. "Look how bad she's shaking. Poor girl's terrified. This is going to be embarrassing." She settled behind the rifle and peered through the scope. The target appeared crisp and clear, but her hands were shaking more than usual due to the pressure. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. What if her grandfather was wrong? What if she really was just a delusional teenager playing at something beyond her capabilities? Then she remembered Miguel's teachings. The tremor wasn't her enemy. It was her rhythm. She stopped fighting the shaking and started working with it, letting her hands find their natural pattern. She controlled her breathing, waiting for the moment between heartbeats when everything aligned perfectly. The first shot surprised her with its clean break. Through the scope, she could see it had hit the center ring. The crowd fell silent, perhaps not expecting such accuracy from someone whose hands were visibly trembling. Sarah fired 4 more shots, each one finding its mark in the target's center. When she finished, Miguel called for a ceasefire and walked downrange to examine both targets. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he studied the paper with a magnifying glass. "Jake's group measures 2.3 inches, he announced. Sarah's measures 1.8 inches. The crowd buzzed with surprised conversation. Sarah had outshot the professional marksman at the first station, and several spectators were reconsidering their initial assumptions about the trembling teenager. Jake's expression had shifted from condescending amusement to focused attention. "Lucky start," he muttered, but his tone suggested he was taking Sarah more seriously now. The second station at 800 yards presented a much greater challenge. At this distance, environmental factors like wind speed and humidity became critical variables. The target was barely visible without magnification, appearing as a small dark dot against the hillside. This time, Sarah chose to shoot first. The longer distance felt more natural to her somehow, requiring the kind of patience and precision she had been developing over months of practice. She studied the wind patterns in the grass, noted how the morning light was hitting the target, and calculated the necessary adjustments to her scope. Her first shot felt perfect the moment it left the barrel. The second shot felt even better. By her 5th shot, she was completely immersed in the zone of concentration that Miguel had taught her to find, where the tremor became part of her natural timing rather than an obstacle to overcome. Jake followed with his own string of shots, each one deliberate and carefully aimed. He was clearly a skilled marksman, but Sarah noticed that he seemed to be fighting the wind conditions rather than adapting to them. When Miguel returned from examining the targets, his expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught a hint of pride in his eyes. At 800 yards, he announced, Jake's group measures 4.1 inches. Sarah's group measures 2.9 inches. The crowd's reaction was much more pronounced this time. Several spectators approached to get a better look at the quiet teenager with shaking hands, who had just outshot a professional at a distance. Most of them had never even attempted. Jake's face had darkened considerably. We still have one more station, he said grimly. And 200 yards is where the real shooters separate themselves from the pretenders. Sarah felt a surge of confidence building within her. Her hands were still shaking, but she no longer cared who saw them trembling. The tremor was part of who she was, and she was finally beginning to understand that it might actually be part of her strength rather than her weakness. The crowd was growing more animated as word spread about the unexpected competition taking place at Miguel's farm. Several people had called friends and family, and cars continued to arrive throughout the morning. What had started as a private challenge was becoming a public demonstration of something remarkable. As they walked toward the final shooting position, Sarah overheard Jake speaking quietly to one of his friends. I don't know how she's doing it, but this isn't over yet. 1,200 yards is where experience really matters. Sarah smiled to herself. Jake Morrison was about to discover that her trembling hands had been preparing for exactly this kind of challenge for longer than anyone realized. The final test was still ahead, and she was ready to show everyone what true precision looked like. The 200-yard shooting position sat on a small hill overlooking a valley where Miguel had placed targets that looked impossibly small through binoculars. At this distance, the slightest mistake in calculation, the tiniest tremor at the wrong moment, or a momentary lapse in concentration would send a bullet completely off target. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, with some bringing lawn chairs and coolers as if attending a sporting event. Jake Morrison stood at the shooting line, studying the distant target through a powerful spotting scope. His confidence from the morning had evaporated, replaced by the intense focus of a professional who suddenly realized he was in a real competition. The casual dismissal of Sarah as just a kid with shaky hands had transformed into grudging respect mixed with wounded pride. Winds gusting from the southwest, Jake announced to anyone listening. Temperatures dropping as those clouds move in. These are challenging conditions even for experienced shooters. Sarah barely heard his comments. She was absorbed in reading the environment, watching grass movement at various distances to map the wind patterns, noting how the changing light affected visibility, and calculating the complex ballistic adjustments required for such an extreme shot. Her hands shook as she made notes in a small notebook, but the tremor felt like a natural part of her process now, rather than an embarrassing condition to hide. Miguel approached his granddaughter quietly. How are you feeling, Mia? Different, Sarah replied honestly. Like I finally understand what you've been teaching me all these months. And what's that? Sarah looked at her trembling hands, then back at the distant target. That being different isn't the same as being broken. My hands shake because they feel everything. The wind, the temperature changes, even tiny vibrations in the ground. Most people have to learn to sense these things, but I've been feeling them my whole life. Miguel smiled, remembering similar conversations with young Marines who had eventually become exceptional marksmen. Now you're thinking like a real shooter. The crowd quieted as Jake prepared for his first shot at the extreme distance. He settled behind his rifle, a high-end precision weapon that probably cost more than Sarah's family earned in several months. His shooting form was textbook perfect, the result of years of professional training and combat experience. Jake's first shot was followed by a long pause as Miguel walked downrange with binoculars to spot the hit. 8 inches low, 4 inches right, he called back. Jake made scope adjustments and fired again. This shot was closer, earning nods of approval from the watching crowd. By his 5th shot, he had found his rhythm and was placing rounds consistently in the target's scoring rings. That's real shooting. Someone in the crowd commented appreciatively. Takes serious skill to hit anything at that distance. When Jake finished, he stood with obvious satisfaction. His group at 200 yards was respectable by any standard, the kind of shooting that demonstrated genuine expertise. The crowd applauded politely, recognizing they had witnessed something impressive. Now all eyes turned to Sarah. She approached the shooting position with her grandfather's old rifle, a weapon that looked almost antique compared to Jake's modern precision instrument. Her hands were shaking visibly as she settled into position, and several spectators exchanged knowing glances that suggested the real shooting was over, and they were about to witness a teenager's inevitable failure. Sarah peered through her scope at the tiny target. At 200 yards, it appeared as nothing more than a small dot, barely distinguishable from the background. The wind was gusting unpredictably, and the light was changing as clouds moved across the sun. These were exactly the kinds of conditions that separated genuine marksmen from weekend hobbyists. But something remarkable happened as Sarah settled behind the rifle. The tremor that had embarrassed her throughout her childhood suddenly felt like a superpower. Her shaking hands were picking up subtle environmental changes that steady hands might miss. She could feel wind shifts through the rifle stock, sense tiny changes in temperature through the metal, even detect minute vibrations in the ground that indicated how conditions were affecting her shooting platform. Her first shot felt perfect. The rifle recoiled smoothly, and Sarah knew instinctively that the bullet was flying true. Miguel's voice carried across the distance. "Dead center!" The crowd stirred with surprise. Hitting the center of a target at 1,200 yards required not just skill, but also a significant element of luck. Surely she couldn't repeat such a shot. Sarah's second shot felt even better than the first, and her third. By the time she fired her fourth round, the crowd had fallen completely silent except for the wind rustling through the grass. Something extraordinary was happening, and everyone present could sense it. Her final shot was the best of all. Sarah squeezed the trigger with perfect timing, using her tremor as a natural rhythm guide, and felt the satisfying certainty that the bullet would find its mark exactly where she intended. Miguel jogged downrange to examine both targets, his excitement barely contained despite his attempts to maintain official impartiality. The crowd waited in tense silence, straining to see his reaction as he studied the paper through his magnifying glass. When he finally turned to face the crowd, Miguel's expression was one of amazement and pride. "Jake's group at 1,200 yards measures 6.8 inches, he announced. Sarah's group measures 3.2 inches. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, with several spectators rushing forward to congratulate Sarah and examine her target more closely. The quiet teenager with trembling hands had just outshot a professional marksman at an extreme distance, demonstrating precision that many experienced shooters never achieve in their entire careers. Jake Morrison stood in stunned silence, staring at Sarah's target through binoculars. His expression was a complex mixture of disbelief, respect, and wounded professional pride. He had been thoroughly defeated by someone he had dismissed as a pretender, and the defeat had taken place in front of dozens of witnesses who would undoubtedly spread the story throughout the local shooting community. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. People were asking her questions, requesting to examine her rifle, and congratulating her on shooting they described as incredible and impossible. Her hands were still shaking, but for the first time in her life, people were looking at the tremor with fascination rather than pity. One of the spectators, an elderly man who had introduced himself as a retired shooting instructor, approached Sarah with obvious admiration. "Young lady, I've been teaching marksmanship for 30 years and I've never seen shooting like that from someone your age. That tremor of yours isn't a disability, it's a gift that lets you feel things other shooters can't." Jake finally walked over to Sarah, his expression serious but no longer hostile. The condescending attitude from the sporting goods store had been replaced by the respect one professional shooter shows another. "I owe you an apology," he said simply, "and I owe everyone here an explanation for my behavior. I was wrong about your abilities, and I was wrong to judge you based on your medical condition." Sarah nodded graciously, though her hands were shaking from adrenaline and emotional overwhelm. The morning had transformed her from a self-conscious teenager, hiding her tremor, into a confident marksman who understood that her difference was actually her strength. But the real test was still ahead. Word of her performance was already spreading beyond the farm, and Sarah would soon discover that defeating Jake Morrison was only the beginning of a much larger challenge that would test not just her shooting skills, but her ability to handle pressure on a scale she had never imagined. By Monday morning, Sarah's weekend performance had become local legend. Jake Morrison, true to his word, had spent Sunday calling everyone he knew in the regional shooting community to recommend Sarah for the upcoming Precision Championship. But his endorsement came with detailed descriptions of her impossible accuracy at extreme distances, stories that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Sarah arrived at school to find her locker surrounded by curious classmates who had heard various versions of the story. Some claimed she had outshot a Navy SEAL at 2 miles. Others insisted she had hit moving targets while blindfolded. The truth was remarkable enough, but teenage gossip had transformed it into something approaching folklore. "Is it true you can hit a dime at 1,000 yards?" asked Jessica, one of the popular girls who had never spoken to Sarah before. Sarah felt her cheeks burn as every student in the hallway turned to stare. Her hands began shaking more visibly, and she instinctively tried to hide them behind her textbooks. "It's not that simple," she mumbled, hurrying toward her first class, but the attention followed her throughout the day. Teachers who had barely noticed her before were suddenly asking about her special talent. Students who had previously ignored or mocked her trembling hands were now treating her like a celebrity. The transformation was overwhelming and confusing for someone who had spent years trying to remain invisible. During lunch, Sarah sat alone as usual, but this time by choice, rather than social rejection. Her table was surrounded by curious students asking questions about rifles, shooting techniques, and whether the stories they had heard were true. Sarah answered politely, but felt exhausted by the constant attention. Mrs. Rodriguez, her English teacher, noticed her discomfort and approached during the afternoon break. "How are you handling all this attention, Sarah?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Yesterday I was just a weird girl with shaky hands. Now everyone thinks I'm some kind of superhero marksman, but I'm still the same person." "Actually," Mrs. Rodriguez said thoughtfully, "I don't think that's true. Yesterday you believed your tremor was a weakness. Today you understand it's part of your strength. That's a fundamental change in how you see yourself." Sarah considered this perspective as she walked home from school. Her phone had been buzzing all day with friend requests from classmates who had never shown interest in her before. The local newspaper had called her house 3 times, wanting to interview the teenage shooting sensation. A regional television station had left a message requesting a feature story. At home, she found her parents deep in conversation with Miguel at the kitchen table. Papers were spread across the surface, including what appeared to be official registration forms and travel itineraries. "Misha," her father called as she entered. "We need to talk about this competition." Sarah sat down, noticing that her mother looked worried while her grandfather appeared excited. "What competition?" Miguel spread out a brochure showing professional shooters in action. "The Western Regional Precision Championship. It's in 3 weeks, and they've invited you to compete in the junior division based on Jake's recommendation and word about your performance Saturday." Carmen placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "The entry fee alone is $500. Then there's travel costs, ammunition, equipment fees. We're talking about thousands of dollars our family doesn't have." But Roberto was studying the prize information. "The winner of the junior division gets a full scholarship to the Colorado School of Professional Marksmanship. That's worth more than our house." Sarah examined the competition details with growing excitement and terror. The junior division included participants up to age 21 from across 6 states. Many were sponsored by gun manufacturers or shooting clubs. Some had been competing at the national level for years, and she would be facing them with her grandfather's old rifle and whatever ammunition they could afford to purchase. "There's more," Miguel said quietly. "Jake called this afternoon. Apparently, word about Saturday has reached some interesting people. A representative from Precision Arms Manufacturing wants to meet with you. They're talking about sponsorship." Sarah's mother looked alarmed. "Sponsorship?" "She's 17 years old. She should be worrying about homework and college applications, not corporate sponsorships and professional competitions." "Carmen's right to be concerned," Roberto added. "This is moving very fast." Sarah went from hobby shooter to potential professional in 1 weekend. Sarah listened to her family debate her future while staring at her trembling hands. 3 days ago, these same hands had been a source of shame and embarrassment. Now they might be her ticket to opportunities she had never imagined possible. But the pressure was already becoming intense and the competition hadn't even begun. That evening, Sarah called Miguel aside for a private conversation. They walked to the barn where her shooting practice had begun. and she voiced the fears she couldn't share with her parents. Abuelo, what if Saturday was just luck? What if I get to this competition and embarrass myself in front of hundreds of people? Everyone will say it was a fluke, that I'm just a kid with a medical condition who got lucky once. Miguel sat on a hay bale and gestured for her to join him. Mija, do you remember the first time you hit a target at 200 yards? Sarah nodded. You thought that was luck too. Then you did it again, and again. Every time you succeeded, you found a new reason to doubt yourself. But luck doesn't repeat itself consistently for months. What you did Saturday wasn't luck. It was the result of dedication, practice, and learning to work with your body instead of against it. Sarah felt some of her anxiety ease, but new concerns remained. What about the sponsorship meeting? I don't know anything about business or contracts or professional shooting. We'll learn together, Miguel promised. But remember, no matter what opportunities come from this, you're still my granddaughter who learned to shoot in this old barn. Success doesn't change who you are at your core. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A black sedan pulled into the farm's driveway and a woman in an expensive business suit stepped out. She introduced herself as Linda Chen, marketing director for Precision Arms Manufacturing, one of the largest rifle manufacturers in the country. Linda's proposal was more generous than any of them had anticipated. Pam wanted to provide Sarah with top-tier equipment, cover all competition expenses, and offer a monthly stipend for training costs. In exchange, Sarah would represent their brand at competitions and allow them to feature her story in their marketing campaigns. Your narrative is exactly what our industry needs, Linda explained to the assembled family, a young woman overcoming a medical challenge to achieve extraordinary precision. It breaks stereotypes and inspires people who might never have considered competitive shooting. Carmen remained skeptical. You want to use my daughter's medical condition to sell rifles? Linda's expression softened. Mrs. Martinez, I want to celebrate your daughter's achievements and help her reach her full potential. Sarah's tremor isn't her limitation. It's part of what makes her extraordinary. We want to support that, not exploit it. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with Linda answering every question and addressing every concern. By the end, even Carmen had to admit the opportunity seemed legitimate and potentially life-changing for Sarah. But that evening, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the rapid changes in her life. 2 weeks earlier, she had been focused on getting through high school without drawing attention to her shaking hands. Now she was considering corporate sponsorship deals and preparing for a competition against shooters with years of professional experience. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jake Morrison. Saw the Pam news. You deserve this opportunity, but remember, that equipment doesn't make the shooter. Your gift is in those hands and your ability to read conditions others miss. Don't let anyone change that. Sarah smiled, appreciating Jake's encouragement. The man who had once dismissed her as a kid with medical problems had become one of her strongest supporters. His transformation in attitude gave her hope that other people might also learn to see beyond surface judgments. The following weekend, Sarah attended her first professional shooting event as an observer. The Southwest Regional Championship was held at a facility with ranges extending to 2,000 yards, distances that made her grandfather's 200-yard shots seem modest by comparison. She watched competitors using equipment worth more than most cars, firing ammunition that cost $20 per round. But what impressed Sarah most wasn't the expensive gear or the extreme distances. It was the quiet concentration of the shooters, their ability to block out distractions and focus entirely on the precise moment when everything aligned perfectly. She recognized that same state of mind from her own shooting, the zone where her tremor became part of her natural rhythm rather than an obstacle to overcome. Nervous about competing here? Asked a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find a young man about her own age wearing a jacket covered in shooting sponsor patches. He introduced himself as Derek Walsh, the defending junior division champion. A little, Sarah admitted. This is all new to me. Derek nodded, understanding. I heard about your performance against Jake Morrison. Impressive shooting, especially at distance, but competition is different from demonstration. The Western Regional Precision Championship took place at Thunder Valley Range in Nevada, a facility designed specifically for extreme long-range shooting competitions. Sarah arrived 3 days early with Miguel and her father, driving through desert landscapes that seemed to stretch endlessly toward mountains that shimmered in the heat. Her new Precision Arms manufacturing rifle case rode carefully secured in the truck bed, containing equipment worth more than her family's annual income. The facility was intimidating in its scale and sophistication. Multiple ranges extended beyond 2,000 yards, with electronic target systems that could register hits to within fractions of an inch. Competitor registration took place in a building filled with displays from major manufacturers, where representatives demonstrated the latest innovations in optics, ammunition, and precision rifles. Sarah felt overwhelmed walking through the vendor displays with Miguel. Every piece of equipment was described as competition grade or professional standard, suggesting that her previous shooting had been amateur hour compared to what was expected here. Her hands shook as she examined rifles costing more than most cars, and several vendors noticed the tremor with expressions of polite concern. "First time at a major competition?" asked a representative from Schmidt & Bender Optics, noting Sarah's nervous examination of their high-end scopes. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Don't let all the fancy gear intimidate you," he said kindly. "I've seen shooters with basic equipment outperform people using our most expensive systems. It's about understanding your capabilities and staying calm under pressure." That evening, Sarah attended the mandatory competitor meeting, where officials explained the 3-day format. Day 1 would feature precision shooting at 600, 800, and 1,000 yards. Day 2 would extend to 1,400 and 1,600 yards. The final day reserved for the ultimate challenge, 2,000 yards, a distance where even the best shooters sometimes struggled to hit the target at all. The junior division included 42 competitors from across 6 states. Sarah studied their faces during the meeting, noting their confident expressions and professional equipment. Most appeared older than her, and several wore jackets indicating years of competition experience. She recognized Derek Walsh from her observation visit, along with several other shooters who had achieved regional recognition. After the meeting, Sarah walked outside to call her mother. The desert night was surprisingly cold, and she could see stars more clearly than ever before in her life. "How are you feeling, Mija?" Carmen asked immediately. "Small," Sarah admitted. "Everyone here has been doing this for years. They have coaches and sponsors and custom equipment. I feel like I don't belong. Your grandfather believes you belong there. Jake Morrison believes you belong there. The company sponsoring you believes you belong there. Maybe it's time you started believing it too." Sarah smiled, feeling some tension ease from her shoulders. "I miss you, Mama. We'll be watching online tomorrow. The whole family is proud of you no matter what happens." The first day of competition dawned clear and windless, conditions that favored consistency over adaptability. Sarah arrived at the 600-yard line to find her shooting position next to Derek Walsh, who greeted her with a friendly nod. "Sleep okay?" he asked while assembling his rifle. "Not really," Sarah answered honestly. "Too nervous." "Good. Nerves mean you care about performing well. Just remember to breathe and trust your training when it's time to shoot." The format allowed each competitor 10 minutes to fire 5 shots for record, with additional time for unlimited sighting shots. Sarah watched the first few competitors fire, noting their methodical approaches and professional demeanor. Their shots were consistently accurate, grouping within the target's scoring rings with mechanical precision. When Sarah's turn arrived, she settled behind her rifle and immediately felt more comfortable. The familiar weight of the stock against her shoulder and the clear image through her scope helped calm her nerves. Her hands were shaking visibly, drawing curious glances from nearby competitors and officials, but the tremor felt natural rather than problematic. Her first sighting shot hit exactly where she aimed. The second shot landed slightly high, requiring a minor scope adjustment. By her third sighting shot, Sarah had found her rhythm and was ready for the record string. The 5 record shots flowed smoothly, each one feeling perfect as it broke from the barrel. Sarah's natural ability to read micro changes in wind conditions gave her advantages that expensive equipment couldn't provide. When the targets were retrieved and scored, her group measured 2.1 inches, placing her 3rd overall after the first stage. The 800-yard stage felt even more comfortable. This distance matched her regular practice at Miguel's farm, and Sarah's confidence grew with each shot. Her final group at 800 yards measured 1.8 inches, moving her into 2nd place overall and 1st among junior division competitors. But the 1,000-yard stage presented new challenges. The distance was at the edge of Sarah's regular practice range, and several competitors who had struggled at shorter distances began to excel as the range extended. Derek Walsh fired a nearly perfect group measuring just 1.3 inches, while Sarah's group opened to 2.4 inches, dropping her to fourth overall. "Don't worry about placement after day one," Miguel told her that evening. "Tomorrow's distances are where your natural gifts will really show." Most of these competitors have never shot beyond 200 yards. Day 2 began with strong, gusting winds that immediately separated experienced shooters from those who relied primarily on perfect equipment and ideal conditions. Sarah watched several top competitors struggle with the changing conditions. Their shots scattered across the target face as they failed to adapt quickly enough to wind shifts. The 400-yard stage was where Sarah's unique abilities began to shine. Her trembling hands could feel wind changes through the rifle stock seconds before they became visible in the grass or mirage. While other competitors fired shots based on their last wind reading, Sarah was already adjusting for conditions that hadn't fully developed yet. Her group at 400 yards measured 2.7 inches, excellent for the challenging conditions. More importantly, it placed her back in second overall and first in the junior division. Derek Walsh, despite his experience, had struggled with the wind and dropped to sixth place. The 1,600-yard stage pushed everyone to their limits. At this extreme distance, bullets took nearly 2 seconds to reach the target, time enough for wind conditions to change multiple times during flight. Mathematical calculations became critical, but so did intuitive understanding of how environmental factors affected bullet trajectory. Sarah's performance at 1,600 yards was extraordinary by any measure. Her group measured 3.1 inches in conditions that had other competitors missing the target entirely. When scores were tallied after day 2, she had taken the overall lead by a comfortable margin, with Derek in second place and a veteran shooter from California in third. That evening, Sarah's phone exploded with congratulations from home. Local news stations had picked up the story of the teenager with trembling hands who was leading a major precision shooting championship. Social media posts about her performance were being shared thousands of times, with many people expressing amazement that someone with a medical condition could achieve such accuracy. But Sarah barely noticed the attention. Her focus was entirely on the final day's challenge, 2,000 yards, a distance where success required perfect coordination of skill, equipment, environmental awareness, and mental toughness. Tomorrow would determine whether her trembling hands could accomplish something truly extraordinary, or if the pressure of extreme distance would finally reveal the limits of her unique abilities. Miguel found his granddaughter sitting alone outside their hotel, staring up at the star-filled desert sky. Her hands were shaking more than usual, but her expression was calm and determined. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded. "I think so. For the first time since we got here, I actually feel like I belong." "What changed?" Sarah held up her trembling hands, studying them in the dim light. "I finally understand that these hands don't shake because something's wrong with me. They shake because they're sensitive enough to feel things other people miss. Tomorrow at 2,000 yards, that sensitivity might be exactly what I need." The final day dawned with swirling winds and gathering storm clouds that made the 2,000-yard targets appear and disappear like mirages in the desert heat. Sarah woke before sunrise, her hands trembling with a mixture of nervous energy and anticipation. Today would either confirm her place among elite precision shooters or expose her as a talented amateur who had reached her limits. The morning news had picked up her story, and camera crews from 3 television stations were setting up equipment around the firing line. Social media was buzzing with posts about the teenage shooting sensation with trembling hands who was leading a major championship. The attention was both thrilling and terrifying for someone who had spent years trying to remain invisible. At breakfast, Sarah sat with Miguel and her father, barely touching her food while watching coverage of the competition on the restaurant's television. The reporter was describing her performance as miraculous and inspirational, focusing heavily on how she had overcome her medical condition to achieve extraordinary accuracy there, making it sound like I've already won. Sarah said nervously, "What if I completely collapse today? What if everyone realizes I'm just a lucky kid who got in over her head?" Roberto placed a reassuring hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Mija, you've already accomplished something remarkable just by being here. Whatever happens today, you've proven that your tremor doesn't define your limitations." But Sarah knew that today was different. The previous 2 days had been impressive, but 2,000 yards was where legends were made. At that distance, bullets took nearly 3 seconds to reach the target, time enough for wind conditions to change dramatically during flight. Environmental factors became critical, and even the best shooters sometimes missed the target entirely. The format for the final day was unforgiving. Each competitor would fire just 5 shots for record, with no sighting shots allowed. Whatever scope adjustments and environmental calculations they made would be based entirely on experience, preparation, and instinct. There would be no opportunity to correct mistakes or adapt to changing conditions between shots. Sarah arrived at the 2,000-yard line to find Derek Walsh already preparing his equipment. Despite falling behind in the overall standings, he appeared relaxed and confident. His setup included every technological advantage available: weather monitoring equipment, ballistic computers, and a rifle system that cost more than most people's cars. Nervous? Derek asked with a friendly smile. Terrified, Sarah admitted. This is way beyond anything I've ever attempted. The distance is intimidating, Derek agreed, but the fundamentals are the same. Read the conditions, make your calculations, and trust your shot. You've been doing that better than anyone else for 2 days. Sarah appreciated his encouragement, but she knew Derek was still a formidable competitor. His experience at extreme distances gave him advantages that her natural abilities might not overcome. Several other shooters had also moved within striking distance of the overall lead, making the final day a genuine contest among multiple competitors. The targets at 2,000 yards were barely visible to the naked eye, appearing as tiny specks against the desert hillside. Through her scope, Sarah could see the target clearly enough, but the distance made every environmental factor critical. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, even air pressure could affect bullet trajectory significantly at such extreme range. Sarah spent her preparation time studying conditions throughout the valley. Her trembling hands were actually helping her detect subtle environmental changes that steady hands might miss. She could feel wind shifts through the rifle stock, sense temperature changes through the metal components, and detect tiny vibrations that indicated how atmospheric conditions were affecting her shooting platform. The first competitor fired his string of shots with methodical precision. Through spotting scopes, officials and spectators could see his bullets impacting the target area, but grouping was difficult to judge at such extreme distance. His final score would depend on precise measurements that wouldn't be available until all competitors finished. Derek Walsh was the 5th shooter in rotation. His shots were deliberate and confident, each one followed by careful observation of impact location. Sarah could tell he was making micro-adjustments between shots, adapting to conditions in real time based on where his bullets were hitting. Sarah was scheduled to shoot 12th in the rotation, giving her time to observe how other competitors were handling the challenging conditions. Wind was gusting unpredictably, requiring constant recalculation of environmental factors. Several experienced shooters had already fired groups that scattered across the target face, their shots victim to rapidly changing conditions. When Sarah's name was called, the crowd that had gathered around the firing line fell unusually quiet. Camera operators moved closer to capture her approach to the shooting position. Even other competitors paused their preparation to watch the teenager with trembling hands attempt something most people considered nearly impossible. Sarah settled behind her rifle and immediately felt the familiar comfort of proper shooting position. Her hands were shaking visibly, drawing attention from spectators who couldn't understand how such tremor could possibly result in precision accuracy. But Sarah was no longer fighting the shaking. Instead, she was using it as a natural timing mechanism, letting her body find its rhythm before attempting each shot. Through her scope, the 2,000-yard target appeared surprisingly clear and manageable. Sarah had learned to trust her equipment and her preparation, but more importantly, she had learned to trust the sensitivity that her tremor provided. Her hands were telling her things about wind conditions and environmental factors that no instrument could measure as precisely. Her first shot felt perfect the moment it left the barrel. The recoil was smooth, the sight picture was clear, and Sarah knew instinctively that the bullet was flying exactly where she had intended. Officials with spotting scopes confirmed the hit, center of target. The second shot required adjustment for changing wind conditions. Sarah's trembling hands detected the shift before it became visible in the mirage patterns other shooters were watching. Her adjustment was subtle but precise, resulting in another center hit that drew murmurs of amazement from the watching crowd. By her third shot, Sarah was completely immersed in the zone of concentration that made everything else disappear. The crowd, the cameras, the pressure, even her own nervousness vanished as she focused entirely on reading conditions and making perfect shots. Her tremor became part of her natural timing, helping her find the precise moment when everything aligned perfectly. Shot 4 landed exactly where she aimed. Shot 5 was even better. When Sarah finished and stood up from her shooting position, the crowd erupted in sustained applause. Officials jogged downrange to measure her group, while spectators and competitors gathered around to congratulate her on shooting that many considered extraordinary. The wait for final measurements seemed endless. Other competitors finished their strings, but attention remained focused on Sarah's target and the possibility that a 17-year-old girl with a medical condition had just achieved something truly remarkable at one of the most challenging distances in precision shooting. When the range officer finally returned with official measurements, his expression was one of amazement. He approached the microphone that would broadcast results to competitors and spectators alike. Ladies and gentlemen, the final day results at 2,000 yards. In third place overall, Derek Walsh with a group measuring 8.4 inches. In second place, Michael Rodriguez with a group measuring 7.1 inches. The crowd waited in tense silence. And in first place, with a group measuring 4.2 inches at 2,000 yards, Sarah Martinez. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Spectators cheered, competitors applauded, and camera operators scrambled to capture Sarah's emotional response. She had not only won the final day but had done so with shooting that established her as a genuine precision marksman, rather than a lucky amateur. Miguel reached his granddaughter first, wrapping her in a proud embrace as tears streamed down both their faces. "Mija, you just hit 15 consecutive shots in the center ring across 3 days of competition. That's not luck. That's not a fluke. That's extraordinary skill combined with courage and determination." Sarah looked at her trembling hands, the same hands that had caused her embarrassment and shame throughout her childhood. Today, those hands had accomplished something most people would consider impossible. The medical condition that had made her feel different and defective had actually been the source of sensitivity and precision that no steady hands could match. The award ceremony that evening was covered by national media, with Sarah's story spreading across social platforms and news networks throughout the country. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came when Jake Morrison approached her after the official presentations. "I owe you more than an apology," he said sincerely. "I owe you a thank you for teaching me not to judge people based on appearances or medical conditions. You've changed how I see the world, and I'm a better person because of it." Sarah smiled, remembering the condescending man from the sporting goods store who had dismissed her as a kid with medical problems. His transformation reflected something larger about how people could learn to see beyond surface differences when given the opportunity. 6 months later, Sarah received a full scholarship to the Colorado School of Professional Marksmanship, where she would develop her skills while pursuing a degree in engineering. Her trembling hands had opened doors she never imagined possible, and her story continued to inspire people facing their own challenges and differences. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that being different wasn't the same as being limited. Her medical condition had been transformed from a source of shame into a source of strength, proving that sometimes what makes us unique is exactly what the world needs most. Her trembling hands had found their perfect purpose, and she would never again see them as anything other than a gift.